Yes, friends, on a Monday, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. Over there, Andy Mackiewicz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise. We're covering Brooklyn Nets basketball on the Locked On Nets podcast. That's more of a me than a we thing, but it all still falls into the same pot, Andy. How jacked up are you as we enter into the week? We're going to talk about some things we have coming up on the show as this week progresses, but we know rookie mini training camp, schedules coming out. Like, this is now the next phase of the New York Football Giants offseason.
Yeah, you go through the draft and you do all this hypotheticals of who we're going to get and what's going to happen. And then finally, all of that happens. There's still a couple of housekeeping things that we're going to talk about today that the Giants need to clear out. But then it really, the primary focus, Adam, goes right to next season, the roster, who's going to be here, who's not, who are you excited about, who can flourish under this new system. I'm really excited to turn the leaf and officially close out last year in my mind and really focus on what's going to be happening moving forward.
And we have potentially here, won't say it out loud until it's officially confirmed, a really big guest coming up probably for Wednesday, we think, but you'll hear about that more over the next couple of days to break down a little bit more of this draft class and where those expectations can be. Going to be doing a live look in on the schedule release on Thursday night as well. So tons of fun stuff to get to, but as we try to turn things over and look to the next season, Andy, there's still a couple of things that are keeping us from moving fully forward. And as open and honest and direct as we think Joe Schoen has been since coming on as the New York Football Giants GM, the James Bradberry update, we'll call it, remains a bit of a mystery, right? Last week, Joe Schoen said we were a little surprised by the lack of interest on the trade market. We heard things come out that James Bradberry and negotiating with the new teams on a contract extension were a part of the reason things broke down. But Schoen said, by the end of the week, one way or the other, this is going to be resolved. It's Monday. James Bradberry is still on the roster. What do you think is going on there? Because it just feels like now, like you're dragging your feet, and there has to be something behind it because it's not like there's any mystery to what happens. You release him, you take dead cap, you get cap room.
Yeah, Dan Duggan does a great job on the Giants beat, just reporting on some of the different facts. We were messaging with him during last week, just saying, "Hey, do you think the contract demands of what James Bradberry was asking for from new teams impacted it?" And he said, a little bit softer. I wouldn't categorize it as necessarily demands that Bradberry was saying, but Adam, you and I talked offline after that different discussion with Dan, but it's been reported that they couldn't agree to terms of what James Bradberry wanted. So like you could call it demands. You could call it, I'm not going to go there unless I get what I want. Like, I don't know how else you can describe it because clearly the Giants wanted to make the deal. There's no reason Joe Schoen would have come out and said, well, it takes three parties to make it happen. And we had some deals on the table, but James couldn't agree to it. You wouldn't say that unless it was a done deal and James put a wrinkle in it by either saying, I want my injury guarantees or I want something else, which to me sounds a little bit like a demand.
Yeah, and listen, as we talked about it a little bit last week, like I'm fine with it on all sides, right? I get why the Giants, why James Bradberry, and why other teams all have their reasons to have reservations or to have stipulations around what they were willing to do. The funny thing is now, the fact that the Giants didn't release him, and one of the other rumors, I don't know if we touched on it on the podcast, was that the Eagles would be one of the first teams in line to try to get the services of one James Bradberry. I do wonder if the Giants and Joe Schoen, because again, as we said all along, this isn't necessarily about a talent piece. This is about a scheme fit and a money piece for the New York Football Giants side of things. If the Giants go back to James Bradberry and say, hey, we're noticing that a division rival could be in line for your services. Is there still a way that we can do this where we get you somewhere else? Because that's what I think the Giants would prefer to do, let alone you said this when we were doing the rundown before we came on, a reason from James Bradberry's side that he may be going, oh, maybe my options once released are not as bright as I thought they were going to be.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I keep thinking about. Jordan Renan actually pointed this out online last week, and he said, oh, it's a little tough for James Bradberry considering the situation that he's in where like the draft is done. Most cap space has already been eaten up. Like how much is he going to get on the open market? So you never know, Adam. He doesn't seem like a scheme fit. Obviously he was a guy that Dave Gettleman signed twice, once, out of school with the Carolina Panthers and then brought him here when he came. So he is one of those people that is part of the old regime. However, if you think about it, maybe the only explanation of James Bradberry still being on this roster is that maybe the sides are coming to the table and trying to discuss a happy middle ground. Because if not, what has changed since what Joe Schoen said last week that James Bradberry would be resolved by the end of the week, aka released, and he's still on the roster? You have to think James Bradberry looked out there and probably had his agent get some feelers like, what am I worth on the open market? And if it's a veteran minimum or $2 or $3 million, why not stick with the Giants and restructure your deal a little bit, get a little bit more guaranteed money this season, and then be a free agent next year? It's kind of similar to what Sterling Shepard did coming off of an injury.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see too, right? I'd mentioned that kind of throughout this offseason, the world where maybe Bradberry does end up being on this roster and you try to situationally use him and show his best value, right? Don't put him into man-to-man single coverage on the outside, but zone looks under Wink Martindale. Get the veteran out there. Let him help coach up some of these young players. And if you're the Giants, who knows how your draft class went? We'll close out on this. The Giants, yes, brought in Flott, right? Brought in Belton. They're going to look at the free agent market. They're going to look at cuts around the league. But was that the perfect version? We talked about the top, right? If Sauce Gardner had been there, that was their number one awesome. And everything still works out great with Thibodeau and then getting Neal. But all of a sudden, you think about what's the depth here. And then ultimately, whether it's keeping him or facilitating a move elsewhere, this is just everybody, I think, kind of agreeing. It's all a little bit softer than we anticipated. Maybe the result can still be the same, even if the mechanics are different.
Let me ask you one more question on this, and it could be a very easy yes or no, Adam. But is there a world where the Giants hold on to James Bradberry for longer, free up cap space in other places, and say, there's no market right now, but you're still very valuable? Maybe there's a trade right before training camp or during the preseason or even before the trade deadline where the Giants get more value out of this?
Oh, of course. Yes. The answer is yes. And it funnels right into our next topic of conversation, which is salary needs. So I'll flesh that out a little bit deeper here in a second. When we talk about the New York Football Giants, depending on who you go by, over the cap has the Giants set with 5.5 million in cap space. Spot Track has them with 6.6 million. The bottom line is they need a little bit north of 13.5 million to get the entire draft class signed and underneath here. So even in releasing James Bradberry or trading him, you're going to get over top of that number. You're going to have a little bit extra to play with on the back end, even potentially. But when you look around the roster, and we've mentioned these guys last week, right? Julian Love, we talk about Darius Slayton, we talk about Nick Gates. Those three players alone can account for $6, $7 to $9 million in cap relief and also come with minimum dead cap hits as well. So, yes, because the Giants can get to a point here where the best benefit, as we kind of moved away from in this discussion around Bradberry, was, well, trading him, right? The post June 1 trade, the latest possible thing that the Giants could accomplish here, also results in the lowest dead cap hit number and the highest cap relief number. So, can they get to that point is the question, right? Can they get all the way into late summer and see how things go around the league? That becomes the curiosity, and it's the one that we touched on a little bit before of, do you think the Giants would rather hold on to James Bradberry now, see what value could materialize for him over the course of the summer, or see if Darius Slayton has something left for the fifth year, right? See if Julian Love is more important, at least in stemming the tide in that secondary than we anticipated. And even Nick Gates coming back from injury, can he be a depth piece for this roster? Right? Any of those guys we talk about, where's the bigger value? For me, it's in keeping James Bradberry and seeing if something can come up here, because all these other guys are either in the last year or represent mid to back end talents on this roster.
Yeah, Adam, the issue that you have, and I like the way that you posed it, honestly, moving off of James Bradberry is better for the Giants. And I'll tell you why. It's a couple of different reasons. The first one is it's a singular move that allows the entire rookie class to be signed. Just keep in mind, if you're a rookie that just got drafted, the Giants are going to say, "Hey, why don't you get out there for rookie minicamp? Hey, why don't you go participate in some of these programs?
Hey, why
And
don't you pay me?
and they're like, "Hey, why don't you guarantee me a contract so if I pop my Achilles, I'm still going to get paid?" Like if you're one of those guys, there's no reason for you to get out there. And the Giants, while they have a little bit of money right now, don't have enough to sign their entire class. So like if you want all of them out there, there's one singular move you can do. The second piece of it is if you're not going to release James Bradberry, that 10 or 11 million dollars means you're going to have to make 4, 5, maybe even 6 different corresponding transactional moves for the Giants. You mentioned Nick Gates being one. We talked about Darius Slayton. Shane Lemieux could be another one.
Yeah.
Julian Love. Like that's only 4. We probably still would need 2 or 3 more moves. And then you're saying completely shaping the roster ahead of training camp and ahead of rookie minicamp. So the path of least resistance right now, while James Bradberry is a good player, is to move off of him so that we could figure out what this roster can be moving forward.
And while some of those guys are like Darius Slayton, right? Is he do we think he's going to be part of the long-term future? No. But other players like a Shane Lemieux, a fifth round pick coming back off an injury, could he be a guy that still sticks around here as a depth piece on this roster? Right. There's going to be names that you want them to have camp. You want them to have reps in the new system so that these coaches can get an eye on them. Whereas out of all of them, James Bradberry is obviously the most known commodity. Everyone understands what he's capable of. And unfortunately, a down year last year as opposed to the year prior when it was, borderline Pro Bowl level, James Bradberry kind of player, that certainly impacted this as well. That being the case, though, we'll talk a little bit about, we want to get into where Brian Daboll stands, where Joe Schoen stands coming out of this draft. As you said, sentiments around a player like Daniel Jones and keeping some of this talent around him going into camp. But there was one other little footnote as well, and that's the compensatory picks that will be coming in for the New York Football Giants next year. These are projections. They're not 100% set in stone. But when we look at them right now, as you know, there's 32 compensatory picks available every single year. It's represented 32 teams, but doesn't mean that they all get, one apiece. It's not allocated here or there. It's predicated on how many you bring in and how many you throw out. So for the New York Football Giants, because the key, as it's listed, key, Evan Ingram, Austin Johnson, and Lorenzo Carter being the key losses. Jabril Peppers is obviously in there as well. Then the additions being Glowinski, Tyrod Taylor as the key additions. And then it goes into say here, as I was looking over on, I want to make sure I get this right here. I'll pull up who wrote this article for us in a second. Oh, Dan Benton did this work over for us on USA Today. You look at those numbers, and it's essentially Glowinski and Taylor's contracts cross-cancel out the Johnson and Carter deals when they sign in free agency. Evan Ingram's contract sits alone, and that gets a fifth-round compensatory pick tied to it. And then you also pick up a seventh-round pick here for the Kean Crossan departure. So the Giants are in a position here to have another 2 late-round picks in next year's draft class. And while it's a fifth and a seventh, I'll tell you right now, we saw the guys that came in the fifth and the sixth round this year from trading back. Getting late round picks matter when you're turning over a roster. I know they made this feel silly, man. I was excited when I saw this. Like, I was like, fifth round pick for Evan Ingram. The thing that I was saying, take a fifth round pick for him. Like, take a fifth round pick for him last year and move off of him. They ultimately look like they're going to be in a position to get that. And that can turn into someone, a special teams contributor, a back end of the roster kind of guy in next year's draft class.
Here's the thing, Adam. When you're a team that has been struggling like the New York Giants have for years and years and years, it generally means, and follow me down this path, Adam, that you don't have
Sure.
that many good players, right? You probably don't have
That's
as many
fair.
good players as other teams. Then it's like, because we're so bad, we probably need to sign our good players to stay here for when we get better than what we are. The
Yep.
Giants have not had that many players walk out the door that are very valuable to other teams. Now, we talk about guys like Dalvin Tomlinson. You talked about Evan Ingram over the years. There's been a handful of guys that Giants had to make some tough decisions on. But yeah, the Giants are never going to be one of those teams that's going like the Rams, who they trade away all their first round picks and then like they develop players very well. They go out on the free agent market and sign a big deal. And the Rams are getting like 2 seconds, a third, like they're getting crazy compensation picks. The Giants are not going to be that team because we just don't have good enough players or haven't for the past couple of years. You hope that with this new regime, we're getting a couple more picks. We're being able to develop some people. You know, I think of it backwards, Adam. I almost wish we weren't getting compensatory picks because that means we're developing our own talent and we're keeping our own talent and we're not, it's a very double-edged sword on the compensatory pick thing. Because you look at a team like the Rams who won the Super Bowl, they're getting a bunch of them because they're developing talent and letting people go out the door. The Giants are not in the same situation.
Yeah, and guess what? The other way to look at it too is like when you sign more free agents in next off season, right? That also mitigates what you're going to get in compensatory picks, right? So because you have money, because you have cap room, and you're able to sign some talented players, it means you're not necessarily going to get guys back in the door. Before we get into the Joe Schoen, Brian Daboll comments and a little talk piece around Daniel Jones here, we were talking about paying the rookie class, and it's funny. Sauce Gardner for the New York Jets, $35 million contract, I think north of 26, 27 million guaranteed. So, just wrapping your head around what these numbers look like. A quick question before we talk free agents that I think this is the other element. If you make the quick cut with James Bradberry, you're talking about maybe having a little bit of money available. Are there things that you would like to see the Giants do over the course of this offseason potentially? But when you hear Sauce Gardner's contract, does it give you pause on it? Because my thought was I love Sauce Gardner, and if he ends up being one of the best cornerbacks in the league, you don't care. But for some reason, the second that I heard the number, I was like, boy, that is a big commitment to a rookie cornerback. Whereas Thibodeau, when he signs his contract, I think edge rushers, right? Those type of impact players, you feel like the quantified value is there automatically, especially for the New York Football Giants, right? Whereas with cornerback, I don't know. It comes and goes, right? And what if he gets picked on? What if he has a bad game, right? Like it's far more likely that a cornerback could have a bad week or two as opposed to an edge rusher always being able to impact the game on a down to down basis.
Adam, that contract for Sauce Gardner is going to blow your mind even more. It was a 4-year, $38 million deal that was fully guaranteed. You said
Oh,
25
fully.
million in guarantee. 25 million was the signing bonus he got for
Okay.
signing on the dotted line. So that is a fully guaranteed deal for Sauce Gardner. So
Yeah.
like he's getting his cash no matter what. It feels like that's kind of the way that things are going a little bit. For those first round picks, they're fully guaranteeing the 4 years. But yeah, I see what you're saying. It feels like there's more of a learning curve for those cornerbacks because they can't make mistakes. A mistake for a cornerback turns into a touchdown. A
Yeah.
mistake for an edge rusher is like, okay, we have another play where I can create a turnover or create a pressure that will change the landscape of the game. So for me, yeah, like paying under $10 million a year to one of those guys feels pretty good if he's going to be that type of game changer.
Yeah, so it was just interesting, man. It was a passing thought where I was like, and again, then you'll see the contract for Neal and we'll see the contract for Thibodeau, and we'll go, well, it's all just enormous amounts of money. So what difference does it make to John Q. Public sitting on the couch trying to figure it all out? But before the last piece, then is we're talking about James Bradberry. We're seeing Sauce Gardner sign for big money. When we think about whether in the secondary or otherwise, everyone is saying, and you and I talked about what should the Giants be looking to do? Pizza Mike and I talked about this around, go sign a veteran cornerback if you assuming you release James Bradberry, right? Are there names though out there? And I think that you're going to say a couple here, like to keep in the mind of New York Football Giants fans. But I think we're on very opposite sides of the aisle when it comes to this topic.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of big name free agents out there that the Giants just aren't going to be in the market for. Like we don't have the cap space already, and we're going to have to release guys that are good players on our roster. It's going to be very tough to bring in said other good players from other teams to be able to do this, and also probably would impact some of the compensatory pick stuff. I don't know when that ends or not, Adam, but a name that I keep seeing online, and there's a couple of Giants, fans and Giants people that are saying Landon Collins is one name that they would potentially like to see come back, knowing how thin we are at the safety position. I mean, he was a guy that played with heart for the Giants, but his second contract with Washington didn't pan out because they saw his limitations of being that in the box, bring the boom safety, not necessarily a coverage type of guy. But it sounds like his beef and his situations were all with Dave Gettleman and with the promises that were made or not made and money that was said to be got and not got. You'd have to think like maybe there's a clean slate there, knowing that the Giants are relatively thin at the safety position. Imagine saving $2.5 million, releasing Julian Love and bringing in someone like Landon Collins for $1 million on the veteran minimum.
Well, yeah, if you tell me it's on the veteran minimum, then maybe. But if we're talking about discretions of the past, right, and saying, so I would love to come back. He's from the East Coast. He's from the area. And then you can go ahead and fix that little whoopsie-daisy by getting me money. Now, we know he went and got paid, obviously, with his time in Washington. But I look at Landon Collins, and I just think this is a guy that is a big thumper. He is a hard hitter. And because he's not great in coverage, as you get older, right, the injury opportunities increase, the impact of your play decreases, and all of a sudden your value looks a lot smaller. So I think that's a familiar name to Giants fans that I get why. And then it's only, it's like 2 or 3 years later and you go, all of a sudden, oh, this is just a dude in the league now, right? And I love Jabril Peppers, but I love Jabril Peppers too. Also, could have been an option out there. I loved Landon Collins when he was with the Giants, but back then when they said push the pause button, don't want to spend that kind of money at the safety position, it turned out to be right. When you look at the contract and the production that he had after he left the Giants, it was the right decision. Let's turn our attention as we round this out too, and this was a good one. You brought this up when we were doing the rundown. the philosophy of this team going into this season, into the training camp, into the offseason program. Brian Daboll had come out, and this is really, we're talking about Daboll and Joe Schoen commitment to Daniel Jones. I labeled it as question mark because as we're going to go through a couple of quotes here from both head coach and GM, I'm curious to see how you present this to the New York Football Giants fan base and how they should feel going forward, as opposed to maybe where I stand. So let's just go with the big one first here from the head coach, Brian Daboll. He does a good job in the huddle. I want him to not be afraid of the consequences and pull the trigger and attack and have a positive mindset and continue to grow and learn. Just starting there, understanding that this is all in the theme of supporting this quarterback. And that's what they said all offseason. He's our starting quarterback. Tyrod knew this when we brought him in. He's the backup. Daniel Jones is the starter. We believe in this kid. He just needs to get out there and let it happen.
Yeah, this to me shows that they understand how to utilize Daniel Jones's skill set. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. Because if you think about it, Daniel Jones had some really great plays. He was able to make things happen, but he had too many turnovers. And so Joe Judge and Jason Garrett basically said, all right, we're going to take away a lot of the good things that Daniel Jones does, and we're going to just make sure that he does not turn the ball over. No matter what, don't turn the ball over. And
Yeah.
because our offensive line was so porous, anytime that there was an issue or a pressure, Nate Solder was getting an edge rusher in the backfield every 2 seconds. Daniel Jones is taking the ball down and not trying to make plays, and as a result, didn't turn the ball over. How did that work out? It didn't work out great because we couldn't manufacture offense and we couldn't win games as a result. What this is telling me is that Brian Daboll is like, no. We fixed the offensive line. We know what your characteristics are. Your first year in the league, first year and a half, he had one of the best deep ball accuracies in terms of, what passes were completed above expectations. Daniel Jones was that guy. So like when he had time in the pocket, he was able to throw it. And that's what Daboll is saying. Forget about all this other stuff. Don't worry about the consequences. We're not caring about the turnovers yet. Go out, pull the trigger, make the deep throws and make it happen.
Yet. I'll push the pause on my response to that here. Let's also talk about the way Joe Schoen referred to him with Daniel Jones. Daniel was the focus of the offseason. Excuse me. It was, hey, how can we give this kid the best chance? This was on an interview on WFAN. And obviously, as you're going to contextualize a little bit deeper, but we love Daniel Jones. Joe Schoen said, we think he's a win with player. So again, it's more affirmation around him. I'm going to hold my tongue here for a moment. Continue to flesh out what you think Joe Schoen is hoping to accomplish as the rookie GM of the Giants franchise.
The last context behind Joe Schoen's quotes, he gave one more. He said, if Daniel Jones can stay on his feet, I think there's enough weapons on this team that we can be a competitive team and win games and get the best version of Daniel Jones. And that is what we're hoping for. And so what he's saying is the same exact thing that Brian Daboll is saying, where it's like, we knew going into this offseason that the offensive line needed to be fixed. We knew that that's the only way that you can get an accurate representation of Daniel Jones. We think that when given time, Daniel Jones has the ability to make plays and throw the ball, and we want him to be ultra aggressive. And if we can get that out of Daniel Jones, we think we have a player that gives us a competitive advantage over others.
Sure. I think if there was there's a few ifs in there, right? If Daniel Jones can do the things that we want him to do, if he can stay upright, if we can get rid of these turnovers. You mentioned earlier there, we'll worry about the turnovers down the line. Well, the problem is that Daniel Jones has had at least a tendency to have issues with it. Although he's cut them down, we've also seen his production get cut down as well. There's a myriad of question marks around not just Daniel Jones, the player, but the team. And that's why I think it's always fair when you hear these talking points, you go, yeah, I can point to a dozen reasons why the team was always going to be bad, almost regardless of who you had under center or at key positions, right? The problem for me, and not even the problem, this is PR. What else are you going to say? We don't have confidence in Daniel Jones. We don't think he's a win-with quarterback. We are looking towards the future. We wish there had been a deeper draft prospect class at the QB position in 2022 because we would have liked to have taken one, right? Like, I think all of these things can validate themselves, like having some of these prospects like a Malik Willis or a Desmond Ridder fall in the draft. If the Giants had taken one, then all of a sudden this narrative is dead in the water, right? And because they weren't necessarily as strong as the prospect class coming out next year, the Giants were able to afford to say, listen, unless we really loved one of these guys and we thought sleeper opportunity here for a steal, yeah, let's not draft a quarterback in the NFL draft because it only furthers the perception we believe in Daniel Jones. And I'm not saying they don't have confidence in him and that they don't have confidence in themselves that we can fix this team, that we can fix the offense, and that we can be more productive. I think all of those things can be true. And they can also know this kid has a ceiling, right? As a pure prospect coming out, we would not have drafted him 6th overall in the NFL draft. And if you start to think about it from that ratio, you could be looking at talking about a 2nd or 3rd round talent on our draft board back in his draft class. And now he's on our roster. We didn't want to take a Malik Willis or a Desmond Ridder in the 3rd round. We weren't going to want to take a Daniel Jones in the 3rd round, but we have him. And we want to maximize what he can be. That's what I think it is. And it's the smart thing to do. Paint a positive picture because this is the player you have. And if at some point, I would want to be long-winded, if at some point he struggles, if at some point it doesn't look good, then you get to come out and say, listen, we wanted him to go for it. We wanted him to be all in on what he could accomplish as an NFL quarterback. And unfortunately, we've seen that inside of that, some of the decision making wasn't good enough. Some of the timing, the passing, the rhythm, all of those things. It was not good enough for our team to be successful. And that's why he's being benched in week X, right? Like that gives you the out. It gives you the explanation. Because the one thing I think, I'm sorry, this is Jason Garrett, right? What did he do? Pull it back, rein it in. What did we not get? Any more information about Daniel Jones, right? That's the biggest mistake that you can make is not say, guess what? We're going to get confirmation by exposure here. And that's what I think this regime is saying. Get out there, go for it, and we'll know one way or the other what you can do.
Look, it's very simple. There needs to be no ancillary excuses as to whether or not Daniel Jones can play in this league. Look at
Exactly.
Josh Allen. Josh Allen struggled year 1. He had all the arm talent and agility in the world and athleticism. And year 2, he still only had like a 58% or sub 60 completion percentage. You know what they did in Buffalo? They said, is it his accuracy? Is that really what it is? Or do we need to get him a number 1 type receiver so that he has that go-to guy? And they go out and trade a 1st-round pick for Stephon Diggs. He looks amazing. And they're surrounding him with talent. They're trying to do the same thing with Daniel Jones, and it does 2 things. One, it says we will no longer give the excuse of, well, Daniel can't do it because the offensive line isn't good, or Daniel Jones doesn't have the weapons, or the defense isn't getting making turnovers so that we have plus field position every now and then. That's number 1. And number 2, Adam, is if it doesn't work out, you have built a roster that is constructed for another quarterback to come in and win. And so that is what a good GM and a good football team does. It's like, hey, we believe in this guy. We're going to remove every obstacle that we can. Hopefully he performs. If he does not, and he is not the guy, at least we're ready-made, like the Indianapolis Colts or other teams that are basically like, we have the team. Let's go get Phillip Rivers. Let's go get Carson Wentz. Let's go get Matt Ryan and try to win this way.
Yep. And at the end of the day, that's why it should feel good if you're a New York Football Giants fan, because Joe Schoen, Brian Daboll, and this organization, to your point, we're taking issues off the table. Not just for Daniel Jones, for the team. You
Right.
need a good offensive line. You need pass rushers. You need talent on a roster, right? So every time we check a box, it's one less reason to say, oh, I wonder if. And by the way, when you talk about John Mara's comments, and he said, we did everything possible to screw this kid up in the first year as the GM, first year as the head coach. You know what you're also trying to do is, hey, John, those things that you talked about, which we believe from the outside looking in were things that were holding anybody back from having success, they don't exist anymore. So you can think that we did everything to screw him up. We tried to do everything to fix him, and he's still broken, or he's a success, right? So that's the other thing too. At the end of this year, you can go to ownership and say, last piece of the puzzle here is the quarterback that we want as the GM and head coach of this franchise.
Yeah, as a GM, at the end of the day, this is perfect because you're like, you did everything to screw it up. I fixed all those problems, and he's still not working out. Like if you say that, you can at least say to him, like, we did everything you asked for. We set him up in a position for success. Either he's going to flourish like you think he is, or we need to go back out there and we're more attractive to every other free agent quarterback out there.
That being the case, my friends, all throughout this week, we're going to be we're going to take a look at Mike Kafka because we kind of talked about how these pieces fit in there. We're going to go back into Darnell to Robinson, excuse me, and talk about what he meant to this team as a draft pick and how he can help improve Daniel Jones in the short and long term, because there is the big player to stretch the field. But what about underneath a guy like Cole Beasley in Buffalo and how he was productive? We're going to look at Wink Martindale and how they can be successful inside that system and what it can look like. And then by the end of the week, with the schedule coming out, we'll take a look at how it maybe breaks favorably for the New York Football Giants. And also, of course, the rookie minicamp kicking off. So a lot of stuff to go over this week. Hopefully, by the way, you're over on YouTube, you're subscribing to the channel, man. We have seen meteoric climbs in the subscribers, in the views, and I could not be any more appreciative of it. So continue to support us as we continue to fire ourselves through this offseason. It means absolutely everything to OGP to have that going for us. And as Andy would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.